The light from my phone screen felt like a physical burn against my skin. There it was in black and white, a text from Evan, the man I was supposed to marry in 3 months. Tonight, I'm bringing my ex back to the house. If you're going to be jealous, go stay somewhere else. Don't make it a thing. The arrogance was suffocating. After 4 years of building a life together, he wasn't just breaking my heart. He was testing how much of my dignity he could strip away before I finally snapped. He expected a frantic phone call, a sobbing plea, or a screaming match. He wanted me to look unstable so he could play the misunderstood hero to his former flame. Instead, I gave him exactly what he asked for. I typed one word, okay, but what Evan didn't know was that okay wasn't a submission. It was an execution. While he was out picking up the woman who used to be his forever, I was on the phone with a locksmith and a legal team. By the time the sun set, his key was a useless piece of metal and his entire life was packed into a storage unit across town. He thought he was inviting a guest into our home. He didn't realize he had just evicted himself from my life. Stay with me, because what happened when he arrived at the front door with her on his arm wasn't just a confrontation, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. This isn't just a story about a cheating fiancé. It's a journey of a woman who stopped playing the victim and started playing the game. You won't believe the legal trap he set for himself or the shocking revelation about who his ex really was. My name is Natalie, and at 38, I have built a career helping women navigate the intricate, often invisible mazes of the human heart as a high-level life coach. I have spent a decade studying the subtle dynamics of power and control, teaching my clients how to reclaim their voices from partners who seek to dim their light. I always thought my professional expertise made me immune to the very traps I helped others escape believing that my 4-year engagement to Evan was a partnership of equals built on a foundation of mutual respect. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my home office, casting long, golden shadows across the face of my client, Martha. At 59, Martha was a woman of elegance and substance, yet she sat before me today with her shoulders hunched, her eyes clouded with a familiar haunting confusion. She was describing a conversation she'd had that morning with her husband of 30 years. He had told her with a voice as smooth as silk that he needed her to pack a bag and stay at her sister's for a few days so they could both have some space to calm down and reassess. As I listened, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the professional recognition of a classic soft control tactic. I leaned forward, my voice calm and steady, as I helped Martha name the beast. I explained to her that he wasn't asking for space for the sake of the relationship. He was displacing her from her own sanctuary to ensure that he held every ounce of decision-making power. It was an eviction disguised as an olive branch, a way to make her feel like a guest in her own life. Just as I saw the light of realization flicker in Martha's eyes, my phone buzzed on the mahogany desk between us. I usually ignore notifications during a session, but a rare instinct made me glance down. It was a text from Evan. The words were so casual, so chillingly devoid of empathy that for a moment the air seemed to leave the room. He told me he was bringing his ex-girlfriend Claire back to our house for the entire weekend, and that if I felt I was going to be too jealous to handle it, I should find a hotel. He added a final dismissive jab. "Don't make this a thing, Natalie. It's just for a few days." The irony was almost deafening. Here I was guiding Martha through the wreckage of emotional manipulation, while the man I shared a bed with was attempting to run the exact same play on me. In that heartbeat, something shifted. The emotional weight of the betrayal didn't crush me. Instead, it crystallized. I wasn't the wounded fiancé in that moment. I was an expert watching a live case study of a predator who had finally grown too bold. As Martha continued to speak, my mind began to perform a rapid clinical audit of the last 4 years. I saw the silent erosion of my boundaries with terrifying clarity. There had never been a raised hand or a shattered plate, which is why I had stayed so long. Instead, there were the micro-invalidations, the tiny constant needles Evan used to deflate my spirit. He would refer to my coaching practice as just talking to people, a hobby that kept me busy while he did the real work as a tax consultant. Whenever I stood my ground, he would bring up Claire, describing her as the fiery one who was too much to handle, a subtle yardstick he used to keep me compliant and quiet. He wanted me to be the cool, rational partner who never made a scene, effectively weaponizing my own professional maturity against me. I realized then that Evan didn't love my stability. He relied on it as a tool to ensure I would never challenge his authority. I finished my session with Martha, walking her to the door with a renewed sense of purpose, my mind already 3 steps ahead. When the door closed, I sat back down and looked at my phone. A second message had arrived from Evan, more baiting than the first. He was asking if I had seen his text and reminding me that he'd be home by 6, likely expecting me to be mid-meltdown, ready to beg him to reconsider. He wanted the drama. He wanted me to scream and cry so he could calmly tell Claire how unstable I had become, casting himself as the long-suffering saint. He didn't want my permission to bring her over. He wanted my reaction to justify his eventual exit. He was waiting for a war of words, but I knew better than to fight on a battlefield he had prepared. I picked up the phone, my fingers steady as I typed a single, devastatingly simple word. Okay. It was the ultimate Trojan horse. By agreeing so readily, I wasn't submitting to his whims. I was accepting the legal and emotional terms he had just inadvertently set. He thought my okay meant I finally knew my place in his world, but what he didn't realize was that I had just accepted his terms legally and emotionally. Sitting in the sudden heavy silence of my office after that final okay was sent, I felt a strange cold peace wash over me. For years, I had navigated Evan's ego like a sailor reading a dangerous tide, always adjusting my sails to avoid his storms. But Evan's greatest weakness was always his belief that he was the only strategist in the room. 3 years ago, when we decided to purchase this sprawling mid-century modern home, Evan had approached the closing with a level of paranoia that should have been a warning sign. He was terrified of the idea of losing in a potential breakup, convinced that as a successful life coach with a public platform, I might somehow use my influence to push him out of his own investment. He had his personal lawyer draft a specific ironclad addendum to our cohabitation agreement, a safety clause designed to protect him. He wanted a guarantee that if I ever acted out, became unstable, or abandoned the relationship, he would be granted immediate exclusive residency while the legalities of the sale were sorted. He presented it to me as a romantic gesture of security, but I knew it was a leash. However, Evan had made one fatal error. He underestimated my own legal counsel. My lawyer, a woman who had seen 1,000 Evans in her career, suggested a subtle, almost invisible tweak to the definition of what constituted a violation of the peace and harmony of the home. We expanded the language to include the introduction of a third party that creates demonstrable emotional distress or an environment of intentional displacement. Evan, so focused on the word abandonment and convinced he would be the one in control, signed the document without a second thought. He believed he was building a fortress to keep me in check, never realizing he was handing me the blueprints for his own exclusion. The text thread glowing on my desk was no longer a message of betrayal. It was a signed confession. By explicitly telling me he was bringing another woman into our shared intimate space and suggesting that I, the primary resident and co-owner, should book elsewhere if I had a problem with it, Evan had legally triggered the very clause he had designed to trap me. He had intentionally created a hostile environment with the documented goal of displacing me from my home. In the eyes of the law, and according to the specific terms of our private contract, he had committed a material breach of the peace. He hadn't just invited an ex-girlfriend over for a drink. He had effectively handed me a court-admissible statement of his intent to harass me out of my own property. I sat there for a moment marveling at the sheer blinding arrogance of a man who thought he could use a cell phone to evict a woman from a house she had largely paid for. I didn't need to scream, and I didn't need to cry. I simply took a screenshot of the entire conversation, backed it up to 3 different cloud servers, and forwarded the file to my attorney with a single-sentence subject line. The clause has been triggered. The machine I had quietly built in the background of our relationship was finally roaring to life. And Evan was still miles away, likely smiling at his steering wheel, completely unaware that the road he was on led straight to a dead end. There is a specific kind of focus that takes over when you stop being a partner and start being a project manager. I looked at the clock. It was 4:15. Evan wouldn't be back until 6. I had 1 hour and 45 minutes to execute a plan that required surgical precision and absolute silence. My first call was to my attorney, who confirmed that the exclusive possession order was technically active the moment Evan's intent to displace me was documented. My second call was to a high-security locksmith I had worked with for several of my high-net-worth clients. I explained that it was an emergency domestic situation involving a breach of a residency contract. Because of my professional standing and the clear legal documentation I provided, they agreed to arrive within 20 minutes. My third call was to a premium white glove moving and storage company. I didn't want Evan to have any excuse to linger or claim I had damaged his property. I told them I needed a controlled pack-out of 1 bedroom and 1 office with everything to be moved into a secure climate-controlled unit immediately. I was moving with a cold, calculated efficiency that even Evan would have admired if it weren't being used against him. Every step was documented, every action was legal, and every move was designed to ensure that when the clock struck 6, the version of the world Evan expected to return to no longer existed. As the locksmith worked on the front door, the metallic clicks of the tumblers being reset sounded like a countdown. In the bedroom, the movers were working with ghostly quietness, packing Evan's designer suits, his expensive watches, and his countless files into reinforced boxes. I stood in the center of the living room, watching my life be surgically separated from his. I felt no guilt, only a profound sense of relief. I was reclaiming the air I breathed, the walls that sheltered me, and the dignity I had nearly let him erode. I checked the Ring camera feed on my phone. The street was quiet. Once the movers had finished and the locksmith handed me the new set of high-security keys, I sat down at my computer. I didn't send a text. I sent a formal email. It was short, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. I informed him that per the peace and harmony addendum of our contract, his right to enter the premises had been suspended due to his documented attempt to displace me. I provided him with the address of the storage facility, the digital key to his unit, and the contact information for my lawyer. I made it clear that any attempt to force entry would be treated as a criminal trespass and a violation of the civil residency order. I hit send at 5:45. The house was quiet again, smelling of the lavender polish the movers used on the floors. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and sat on the sofa facing the front door. I wasn't hiding, and I wasn't afraid. I was simply waiting for the inevitable moment when Evan's reality would finally collide with the consequences of his own hubris. By the time he brought his ex-girlfriend to the front porch, the house had already chosen its rightful owner. The golden hour was fading into a bruised purple twilight when the headlights of Evan's car finally swept across the driveway. I sat in the darkened living room, the glow from my tablet illuminating my face as I watched the high-definition feed from the front porch camera. Evan stepped out of the car with a self-assured swagger, adjusted his blazer, and then turned to open the passenger door for Claire. She looked exactly as I remembered, polished, expensive, and draped in an air of manufactured helplessness. Evan was whispering something to her, likely a reassuring lie about how easy this transition would be, as he led her toward the door I had spent 4 years calling home. He reached into his pocket with the casual confidence of a man who owned the world, pulled out his key, and slid it into the lock. I watched his expression through the lens. First, a flicker of confusion when the key refused to turn, then a small patronizing chuckle as if the lock were merely being stubborn. He tried again, putting his shoulder into the door, but the high-security deadbolt didn't budge. The confusion rapidly curdled into a hot, visible anger. He began to rattle the handle, then pounded his fist against the solid oak frame. Claire stood back, her eyes wide, as the man who had promised her a grand entrance began to scream my name into the wood. He looked directly into the Ring camera, his face distorted and red, demanding that I open the door and stop being childish. He was performing for Claire, trying to reclaim his dominance through sheer volume, but I remained a ghost. I didn't shout back, I didn't crack the door to negotiate, and I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing my tears. I simply watched the meltdown of a man who realized for the first time in his life that his charm had no power over a deadbolt. The sight of him shivering with rage while Claire looked on in burgeoning embarrassment was a more powerful reclamation of my space than any argument could ever have been. As the minutes stretched into an hour, my phone became a battlefield of digital aggression. It buzzed incessantly against the velvet cushion of the sofa, a barrage of missed call notifications and rage-filled voicemails that grew increasingly incoherent. Evan was cycling through the classic stages of a cornered manipulator. First came the righteous indignation, then the threats to call the police, followed by a sudden jarring shift into a faux tender plea for us to talk like adults. He was desperate for me to engage, to pick up the phone and offer him a stage where he could perform his gaslighting routine. He wanted me to provide him with a reason to call me unstable or hysterical. But I knew that in the world of high-conflict personalities, silence is the only weapon they cannot parry. I had already informed the local precinct of the legal residency order, and my lawyer was standing by to handle any official inquiries. Every time a new vitriolic text popped up, I simply took a breath and stayed in the stillness. I was choosing peace over the hollow victory of being right in a shouting match. For a woman of my age and experience, there is a profound luxury in realizing that you no longer owe a liar your time or your voice. By refusing to enter the arena, I had robbed him of the only thing he truly needed to sustain his ego, my participation in his drama. The silence in the house was heavy, but it was the weight of a shield, not a burden, and for the first time in years, the air I breathed felt entirely my own. By the following morning, the battle had shifted from the front porch to the digital town square of our social circle. Evan, true to form, began a frantic campaign of damage control. I started receiving cautious, concerned messages from mutual friends and professional colleagues. Evan had been busy weaving a narrative that I had suffered a catastrophic mental break and had locked him out in a fit of inexplicable paranoid jealousy. He was playing the role of the tragic fiancé, grieving the loss of the woman he thought he knew, hoping to use the community's sympathy to pressure me into subjection. He expected me to go on the defensive, to start a public mudslinging campaign that would only reinforce his claim that I was out of control. Instead, I took a clinical professional approach. I didn't write a long emotional post or call people to sob my side of the story. I simply selected a few key influential figures in our circle, the people Evan respected and feared most, and sent them a short, neutral message. I attached the unedited text thread where Evan told me to book elsewhere if I was jealous of his ex moving in. I didn't add a single insult or a word of commentary. I simply let his own arrogance speak for itself. The reaction was swift and silent. The nice guy mask he had worn so carefully for years didn't just slip, it disintegrated. When people saw the cold, calculated way he had tried to displace me, the sympathy for his suffering evaporated instantly. They saw a calm, professional woman protecting her home, and a man who had tried to treat his fiancée like an inconvenient tenant. The social capital he had spent decades building was gone within the hour, incinerated by the very words he had used to try and break me. He wanted me to look crazy to the world. But silence is a mirror, and it was finally showing everyone exactly who he was. The heavy silence that followed Evan's public fall from grace was broken 48 hours later, not by another rage-filled voicemail, but by an email that arrived in my professional inbox. The subject line was blank, but the sender's name stopped my heart for a beat, Claire. I braced myself for a defensive tirade or a desperate plea for me to let her fiancé back into his home, but as I began to read, the air left my lungs for an entirely different reason. Claire wasn't writing as a rival. She was writing as a woman who had just realized she was standing in the middle of a crime scene. She was shaken, her prose fractured and raw, describing a version of the last 6 months that made my blood run cold. Evan had told her that our engagement had ended nearly half a year ago. He had painted me as a squatter, an emotionally unstable ex-partner who refused to vacate his property, someone he was too kind to forcibly remove, but who was making his life a living hell. The weekend trip wasn't a callous attempt to flaunt a mistress. In Claire's mind, it was supposed to be the moment they reclaimed his home from a delusional trespasser. Evan hadn't just betrayed my trust. He had used Claire as a human battering ram, a psychological tool to execute a forced exit strategy he had been meticulously planning. He had hoped that by bringing her into the house, he would provoke the very breakdown he had described to her, giving him the perfect excuse to call the police and have me removed under the guise of protecting his new partner. Claire was horrified to realize that she hadn't been a guest in a new life, but a weapon in an old war. As I sat there processing the sheer scale of Evan's deception, a strange sense of familiarity began to itch at the back of my mind. I opened my business portal and scrolled back through several weeks of messages from my coaching page looking for a specific thread from an anonymous user who had been seeking advice on a controlling and manipulative partner. The user, who went by the handle C Blue, had described a man who moved too fast, who tried to isolate her from her friends, and who always had a tragic story about an unstable woman from his past. I compared the dates of those messages to the timeline Claire was now providing in her email, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. Claire was C Blue. The woman Evan was using to gaslight me had been the same woman seeking my professional counsel to escape him. She had been testing Evan's loyalty, sensing something wasn't right in the fairy tale he was spinning, and Evan had failed her test in the most spectacular way possible. He had tried to use the woman who was questioning his character to destroy the woman who knew his character best. We weren't enemies at all. We were two sides of the same coin Evan had tried to spend to buy himself a fresh start. He had banked on our mutual silence and the jealous wife trope to keep us apart, never imagining that his victim and his weapon would ever find a common language. There was no need for a dramatic confrontation or a staged alliance. I didn't reach out to Claire with a plan for girl power revenge. I simply responded to her email with a clinical professional timeline of my last 4 years with Evan. I attached the mortgage statements showing my financial contributions, the original cohabitation agreement with the safety clause, and the unedited text messages from the very day he tried to bring her over. I provided her with the receipts of his reality. I didn't need to convince Claire. I only needed to show her the truth and let her intelligence do the rest. Seeing the cold, surgical way Evan had managed both of us, Claire didn't need any more evidence. She saw the common denominator of chaos in our lives, and she chose herself. 2 hours after receiving my reply, Claire sent me a final note. She was at the airport heading back to her home city, having blocked Evan's number on every platform. She left without a word to him, without a scene, and without giving him the closure he so desperately craved to maintain his ego. Evan was left standing in the wreckage of his own design, stripped of the woman he wanted to control and the woman he wanted to replace her with. He was truly alone for the first time in his life, silenced by the very women he thought he could play against each other. He thought he was choosing between 2 women. He didn't realize that both of us had already walked out of the room. In the weeks following Claire's departure, I watched Evan's life begin to unravel with the quiet, relentless precision of a sweater coming apart at the seams. I didn't have to lift a finger or utter a single disparaging word to the public. My revenge was far more profound and devastating in its simplicity. I simply stopped being the invisible scaffolding that held up the facade of his greatness. For 4 years, I had been the silent architect of his professional persona, editing the jagged, arrogant edges out of his business emails and managing the social anxieties he masked with bravado. I was the one who reminded him of his clients' birthdays, the one who scripted his difficult conversations, and the one who smoothed over his countless professional blunders with a charm he thought was his own. When I withdrew that support, the results were almost immediate. Evan's professional world began to fray because he truly believed his success was a product of his own genius rather than my constant, exhausting labor. Without my invisible hand to guide his communications, his natural arrogance began to bleed into every interaction. He lacked the attention to detail that I had provided for years, and he lacked the emotional intelligence to realize that the people he worked with were starting to recoil from the unfiltered version of himself. I retreated into my own life, focusing on my clients and my own peace, and I watched from a distance as Evan's world grew smaller and more chaotic. He was a man who had forgotten that his pedestal was built on my shoulders, and when I stepped away, he had nowhere to go but down. The true collapse, however, wasn't just in his output, but in a complete audit of his character by everyone we had ever known. Evan had spent years treating people like chess pieces, convinced that his subtle put-downs and his cold superiority would always be covered by my reputation for grace and integrity. He had navigated the professional world under the protective umbrella of my good name, but now that umbrella was gone. Clients who had stayed with him solely because they trusted me and valued my association with his firm began to quietly pull their accounts. They noticed the shift in tone, the lack of follow-through, and the burgeoning desperation that Evan tried to hide with even more arrogance. I didn't have to sabotage him because Evan's own personality was a self-sabotaging machine that had finally been allowed to run at full speed. People began to remember the way he had talked over me at dinner parties, the way he had dismissed my career as just talking, and the way he had tried to weaponize Claire against me. The natural consequences of his behavior were finally catching up to him, and it was a reckoning he was entirely unprepared for. He had lived for so long under the delusion that his power was inherent to his being, but as his influence withered, he was forced to realize that his power had actually been a gift I had been giving him every single day. He was becoming a ghost in his own industry, a man whose phone had stopped ringing because the woman who made him worth calling was no longer there to answer for him. As his professional and social standing disintegrated, the legal battle over the house reached its inevitable conclusion. Evan had tried to fight, but he was a man running out of oxygen. He had no allies left to vouch for his character, and more importantly, he was facing a mounting pile of legal fees and a shrinking income. The hostile environment he had documented in his own text messages made his legal position practically indefensible. My attorney moved in with surgical timing, offering a final buyout of his portion of the property. We didn't offer a penny over the fair, non-inflated market value, and we didn't offer him a single concession for his emotional hardship. Evan had no financial leverage left and no one to turn to for advice or a loan. He signed the papers in a sterile law office, his hand shaking slightly as he realized he was officially losing the home he had tried to steal from me. He didn't sign because he had found some hidden shred of decency. He signed because he was cornered by the reality he had created. There was no shouting, no final dramatic plea, and no moment of cinematic reconciliation. It was a clean, professional, and devastatingly final transaction that stripped him of his last remaining claim to my life. When he slid the signed documents back across the table, he looked at me with a hollow, desperate expression, finally realizing that I was no longer a person he could manipulate, but a wall he could no longer climb. A week after the papers were filed, I received a final lengthy message from him. He wasn't raging this time, he was pathetic. He wrote about his regrets, his confusion, and his need for us to sit down one last time so he could get closure. He claimed he needed to understand how we had gotten here and that he deserved the chance to say his piece. I read the message twice, marveling at the persistent narcissism of a man who still believed he had the right to demand my energy. He didn't want closure. He wanted one last opportunity to pull me back into his orbit to see if he could find a crack in my resolve and use it to feel powerful again. He wanted me to be the bigger person so he could feel like less of a failure. But I knew that true closure is not a collaborative effort. It isn't a conversation you have with the person who tried to destroy you, and it isn't a gift they can ever give you. I didn't reply to the message, and I didn't block him. I simply deleted the thread and felt nothing at all. I stood in my kitchen looking out at the garden I had planted, and I realized that the air in the house was finally clear of his influence. I had reclaimed my space, my career, and my soul by simply refusing to protect a man who never valued my protection. He asked for closure. That's when I understood closure isn't something you demand from others. It's the door you lock from the inside. The weeks that followed the finality of the legal buyout were the quietest of my life, a silence that felt less like a void and more like a long-awaited exhale. With the door to my past firmly locked from the inside, I began the process of decontaminating the sanctuary Evan had tried to turn into a prison. I repainted the walls, replaced the furniture he had favored, and filled the rooms with the scent of fresh eucalyptus and cedar scents he had always claimed were too strong, but which now served as a fragrant boundary between his era and mine. My coaching practice transformed alongside my environment. I launched a specialized program specifically for women over 50 who had spent decades in the shadow of high-conflict partners teaching them the same okay protocol that had saved my own life. I wasn't just a coach anymore. I was a living testament to the fact that it is never too late to reclaim the steering wheel of your own destiny. The house no longer stood as a monument to a betrayal or a hard-won victory in a legal war. It became a vibrant, light-filled space where the only energy allowed was that of growth and self-respect. I found that I no longer woke up with that low-grade hum of anxiety in my chest, the constant anticipation of a subtle jab or a manipulative test. Instead, I moved through my days with a lightness I hadn't known since my early 20s, realizing that the greatest revenge wasn't making Evan suffer, but becoming so indifferent to his existence that he no longer occupied even a square inch of my emotional real estate. Across town, the reports of Evan's new life reached me like echoes from a distant fading radio station. He hadn't been destroyed by a single catastrophic event, but rather by the slow grinding reality of his own mediocrity. Without my invisible hand to curate his professional image, his career had plateaued and then begun a steady decline. He was living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment, a space that lacked the curated elegance I had provided for him, and his social circle had withered down to a few drinking buddies who didn't know the truth of his character. He was forced to confront the one thing he feared most being ordinary and entirely ignored. The admiration he had once commanded was gone, replaced by a cautious distance from anyone who had seen his true colors. He tried to start new relationships, but without the nice guy mask that I had helped him maintain, they fizzled out within weeks. He was trapped in a loop of his own, making a man who had traded a lifetime of genuine support for a weekend of ego-driven power play. He realized too late that I hadn't been an accessory to his life. I had been the foundation, and when the foundation walks away, the structure cannot stand. He was left to navigate a world that had grown cold to his charms, a man who finally understood that power is not something you take from others, but something you lose when you treat people like pawns. I stood on my porch recently watching the sun dip below the horizon in a spectacular display of fire and violet, and I thought about that one-word text message that had changed everything. Okay. It was such a small word, a mere 4 letters that Evan had interpreted as a white flag of surrender. He had spent his life believing that women like me were defined by our willingness to argue, to plead, and to maintain the peace at any cost. He thought my silence was a sign of weakness, never imagining that it was actually the sound of a woman finally deciding that he was no longer worth the breath it took to disagree. Looking back, I realized that the moment I sent that text, I wasn't just agreeing to his terms. I was agreeing to my own freedom. I was accepting the reality that the man I loved didn't exist and that the man who stood in his place was someone I could simply choose to stop seeing. The peace I feel now is not the peace of a truce, but the peace of a finished story. I have built a life that is entirely mine, fueled by the strength I once wasted on him. And I have never felt more powerful than I do in this deliberate, beautiful silence. The journey from being a target of manipulation to being a master of my own fate wasn't easy, but it was the most important work I have ever done. I realized that the hardest part of leaving a toxic situation isn't the logistics or the legalities. It is the moment you stop waiting for the other person to change and start changing the way you respond to them. When you stop giving a manipulator the reaction they crave, you reclaim the power they stole. My story is a reminder that you are never trapped by a contract, a mortgage, or a history with a person who doesn't value your soul. You always have the key to your own exit. You just have to be brave enough to turn it. As I look out at my garden flourishing in the evening light, I know that I will never again let someone else tell me where I belong or how much I am worth. I have locked the door on that version of myself, and the woman who remains is finally home. If someone dared you to leave, would you stay and argue, or would you quietly lock the door and let the silence tell the rest of the story? If this story of reclaiming power resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel to join our community of strong, independent women. Your perspective is incredibly valuable to us, and we want to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a situation where silence was your greatest weapon, or perhaps you have advice for others navigating difficult transitions? Please share your experiences and opinions in the comments below to stimulate a meaningful conversation and support others on their journey. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to ensure you never miss an empowering story of resilience and ultimate satisfaction.